Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. We're here to discuss EDA's Sprint Challenge. This is an informational webinar designed to give a little bit of a programmatic overview and a little bit more insight into the application process for the Sprint Challenge. Before we jump into it, we'd like to introduce our team. I'm Amanda Costi. I'm an economic development specialist in the Office of Innovation and Entrepreneurship. I've been with EDA for just over 2 months now and came from a National Higher Education Association here in Washington, D.C., where I served for 5 years as a project manager for workforce and economic development. And prior to that, actually worked in a tech incubator in the Midwest. A quick fun fact about me is I'm from a very rural town in California that literally has one stoplight. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Misha, to introduce herself.
Thanks. My name is Misha McDaniel, and I also joined the OIE team this summer as an economic development specialist. My background is in philanthropy, specifically designing and implementing place-based community economic development programs. I'll be working with the Sprint Challenge grantees after the conclusion of the competition. A fun fact about me is that I visited 8 state parks this summer in and around my home in North Carolina. Now let's turn it over to Emily.
Thanks, Misha. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. My name's Emily Miller. I'm in the role of acting director for the office. Have been with the team now for about 2 years. Really excited to be here. I am a recovering entrepreneur myself. And my fun fact is that my company was featured on Shark Tank and we got a deal with Mark Cuban. So, all right, let's jump into it. So we wanted to start off by giving a quick background and overview on our office itself. So we are the Office of Innovation and Entrepreneurship, affectionately referred to as OIE because we love our acronyms. And we are housed in the U.S. Economic Development Administration, EDA, which is a bureau within the U.S. Department of Commerce. And our mission is to empower communities so that entrepreneurs can launch companies, scale technologies, and create the jobs of tomorrow. So our mission is really all about furthering tech-based economic development. And we do this through a few ways. One is by promoting thought leadership through our National Advisory Council on Innovation and Entrepreneurship. We also do this through federal collaboration, working with other federal agencies in the innovation and entrepreneurship space. And third, and probably most importantly, what you're all here for today, are through our grant programs. The Sprint Challenge is our newest national competition, so we're really excited to talk to you more about that today. All right, the CARES Act. I'm sure many of you, excuse me, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the CARES Act. The Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act was signed into law and provides EDA with $1.5 billion for economic development assistance to help communities prevent, prepare for, and respond to the coronavirus. EDA CARES Act Recovery Assistance is being administered under the authority of our Bureau's very flexible Economic Adjustment Assistance Program, the EAA program, which provides a wide range of financial assistance to communities and regions as they respond to and recover from the impacts of the pandemic. EDA's goals here are to deploy the CARES Act funding as quickly, effectively, and efficiently as possible, and in a manner that meets communities' needs. So you'll see here, there are many tools through which we're able to do this, planning and technical assistance, the capitalization and recapitalization of our revolving loan funds, construction or other infrastructure projects. But the real goal here for the Sprint Challenge is that last bullet in bold, innovation grants. As we advance through the economic recovery period, businesses and families will rely on American innovation and technology to build more resilient regional economies for the future. And that's why we're really trying to harness the power of innovation and entrepreneurship to respond to the coronavirus pandemic. For those of you familiar with EDA, you'll probably recognize here that the Sprint Challenge looks a little bit different than some of our traditional OIE programs. Sprint Challenge is awarded under the EAA program, so there are some really specific and unique nuances to the EAA program that are different from our other OIE programs. So we're going to talk through the details of that here in the webinar in just a little bit. But I'm really pleased to announce the launch of EDA's new national competition, which stands for the Scaling Pandemic Resilience Through Innovation and Technology, or the Sprint Challenge. Sprint Challenge will harness America's entrepreneurship potential to respond to the challenges caused by the coronavirus. And now I'll hand it off to my colleague, Amanda.
Thanks, Emily. As part of the CARES Act, $25 million was allocated for this challenge. This challenge's goal is to enable regional innovation economies to rapidly address the economic, health, and safety risks caused by the coronavirus, and to do that through entrepreneurship and innovation. Now, before we dive more into the program, we'll give you the high-level funding opportunity. Applicants can request up to $500,000 over a 12-month period of performance, or request up to $750,000 over an 18-month period of performance. You cannot apply for both funding levels, so we encourage you to think strategically why one might make more sense for your community over the other. And this program is really designed for operations and programming support. It's a short, high impact period of performance to help you more rapidly respond to the pandemic. And it's designed for grantees to really jump into action. We listed it here and we'll list it a few more times, but please write down, application deadline is December 3rd, 2020 at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time. This is a hard deadline. So again, December 3rd, 2020 at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time. So who should apply for this funding opportunity? Well, for our policy wonks out there, our eligibility follows PWEDA eligibility guidelines. Similar to other OIE programs, we do not make direct investments into companies or individuals. Unlike some of our other programs, public-private partnerships are not allowable under this grant. But what are allowable are organizations that are economic development districts, state, county, city, or other political subdivisions, Indian tribes or a consortium of Indian tribes, higher education institutions or a consortium of institutions of higher education, public or private nonprofit organizations. However, it is important to note with nonprofits, they need to have state support and show that you're acting in cooperation with officials of a political subdivision of a state. And that looks like letting us know that in the form of a letter as part of your attachment. I just want to reiterate again, when we think through the larger entrepreneurial ecosystems, our target applicant is not the startup company itself or the entrepreneur. We're looking for the organizations that are supporting the entrepreneurs. Think accelerator programs, startup incubators, economic development districts, community-based organizations, etc. So this program has an 80-20 match rate, which is lower than some of our other programs. There are a few exceptions we'll talk about in a minute, but what exactly does the 80-20 match mean? Let's break it down. If selected, your grant funds can cover 80% of total project costs. That means your organization and community is responsible for providing or matching the remaining 20% of the project funds. This match shows strategic partnerships and buy-in from your community. This requirement will apply to the large majority of applicants. So start talking to your community partners sooner rather than later. The matching dollars can be cash or in-kind contributions. We really do not have a preference between the two, but we will need commitment letters highlighting the specificity of the contribution. However, all matching dollars, whether in kind or cash, must be committed to the project for the period of performance, meaning the funds must be dedicated to this project, be available as needed, meaning you should be able to access them when the project starts and what they were outlined to do in the budget, and not be conditioned or encumbered. So there should not be ties to the funds, and they need to be able to be used in the way that they were outlined in the proposal. Now, there are a couple of exceptional circumstances, and I'd really like to highlight the word exceptional. Most large majority of grantees will need to do the 80-20 match. However, we have two exceptions. The first is for Indian tribes. EDA can establish a maximum investment rate of up to 100% for projects for Indian tribes or projects where the Assistant Secretary determines the applicant has exhausted its effective taxing or borrowing capacity. And it's important to note, neither federal nor the matching share funds that we just talked about can be invested in startups or in other companies, whether that's through equity, debt, or hybrid mechanisms. Either way, it's not an allowable expense. So now let's dive into what this Sprint Challenge programming looks like. There are 4 strategic priorities of the funding opportunity. Applicants can pick more than one, but really should focus on addressing economic injury in their community. We have no quota to meet here and really have no preference on which area applicants choose to focus on. You don't have to hit all of them. You can focus all on one, or you can apply to all of them. Really, it's about addressing what your community needs and what will work best for you and what will support your region the best way possible. The 4 strategic focus areas are biotechnology, health security and supply chain, regional, national, and government connectivity, access to capital, and entrepreneurship support. Again, these are strategic priorities, but you're not limited to these focus areas in your application. Really about addressing what's going on in your community. We want to dive in a little bit deeper into these different focus areas. The first strategic focus area is biotechnology, health security, and supply chain innovation. There are some examples listed here, but the idea is to support the commercialization of technologies and supply chain resources to address specific needs in these areas. This program is designed as an immediate short-term response to the pandemic. Emily, care to give an example?
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. I just wanted to kind of talk through what this might look like in practice. These are obviously very immediate response to the pandemic. And here's what it could look like for kind of these intermediary support organizations. An example could be maybe there's a biotechnology or life science innovation program. It could be run out of an accelerator or maybe a university tech transfer program. But let's say that biotech or life science program is really working to support entrepreneurs that are specifically responding to the pandemic. Maybe they're doing contact tracing technology. Maybe they're developing vaccines or other science or technology related to the pandemic. That would be a fantastic kind of framework for a project for the Sprint Challenge. On the supply chain front, another really interesting example that we've seen a few instances of are maker spaces that are out there. There are some kind of more traditional maker spaces that have actually entirely pivoted their programming to support pandemic response. So maybe using their maker spaces to create additional PPE, partnering with local universities, things like that, creating masks and face shields with their 3D printers and other technology. Another example could be collecting, vetting, and distributing FDA-approved designs in an open source format so that local communities and programs can partner with makerspaces. So there are a lot of really interesting opportunities here in this kind of bucket of activities.
Thanks, Emily. Moving on to our second area, entrepreneurship support. The idea here is to promote diversification of economies and address specific challenges that entrepreneurs are facing in the community as a result of coronavirus. A few examples here, helping pivot business models, helping provide resources, etc. I will say, if you are planning to focus on this area of entrepreneurship support, it needs to be directly impacting startups who are struggling to survive because of coronavirus. Needs to be specifically addressing the pandemic and the response. Emily, care to elaborate?
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. So exactly like Amanda stated, this is not designed for kind of a general entrepreneurship support program. This programming needs to be very specific to supporting entrepreneurs as they navigate the challenges of the pandemic. That could look a lot of different ways. You see a few examples here on this slide. It could be programs that are helping businesses pivot their business models to maybe a more e-commerce or virtual environment. You could be setting up a mentor network where you're connecting entrepreneurs with really specific resources. Maybe you want to connect entrepreneurs with pro bono accountants or marketers or people who can help them access PPP funds, things like that. So it's got to be very, very specific to the pandemic. What we don't want to see are just kind of repurposed general entrepreneurship support programs. That is really not what we're trying to do here. It's got to be very specific to helping entrepreneurs as they navigate this economic shock.
Thanks for the clarity, Emily. Moving on to the third strategic focus area, which is regional, national, and government connectivity. This is about leveraging government relationships to support entrepreneurship and innovation. How are you supporting relationship development in the region? Again, still focused on addressing coronavirus. And this might also come into play a little bit more when you look into kind of the SEDS requirements for this grant? Emily?
Yeah, great point, Amanda. I think this one is really all about, we've seen some interesting models here. It could look a lot of different ways. Some states have really stepped up, and they've created kind of a crisis center at the state to help entrepreneurs get connected with resources. This could be, a program that is trying to connect entrepreneurs with federal labs, or maybe even like NSF resources. It could look a lot of different ways, but how are we plugging in these entrepreneurs to state, regional, national kind of points of interest that can help these entrepreneurs get their solution into the marketplace faster?
Thanks. And finally, the fourth area is access to capital. As we all know, there's a liquidity crisis for startups going on who are counting on surviving on cash flow. EDA has revolving loan funds, but we also want to be able to support these startups and through innovative financing mechanisms. So thinking about angel networks, providing bridge financing, or innovations in revenue model generation work. Other ideas in creativity and innovation in various ways of access to capital. Emily, do you have other examples you'd like to share?
Yeah, I just wanted to draw the example here for those of you who might be familiar with the Build to Scale Capital Challenge. I think it's a very similar approach where we're trying to really support those intermediary organizations. That could look like an early stage seed fund. It could look like an angel capital network, like Amanda mentioned. It could be a fund that is testing out alternative financing. Maybe that's someone who's testing out revenue-based models in lieu of venture capital to help these kind of cash-strapped companies see themselves to the other sides of this pandemic and this economic shock. So we're really looking for people to get kind of creative and innovative about the capital models that we might support. A point of clarification here as well is that the federal funds from the Sprint Challenge can never be used as a pass-through to entrepreneurs or to startups. So the funds cannot be used to actually capitalize a fund, but they can be used to support the kind of back-end operations of running a fund itself. If you need money for salaries or operations or marketing cost or legal due diligence, those are all great ways to think about leveraging these funds.
Thanks, Emily. That's a really important clarification. So now we've thought through the programmatic side of what we'd like to do with the Sprint Challenge. Now it's time to dive into the application. But before you dive into the application, it is really important that your organization is ready to do that. In order to make a grants.gov account, in order to access the application, your organization will need an EIN number, a DUNS number, and be registered on SAM. Here's a quick little snapshot of what that will look like with some expected timelines to help you make sure you plan early to get the application process done in time by our December 3rd deadline. So now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Misha, who will walk us a little bit deeper into the application process.
Thank you for that introduction, Amanda. Now let's review the specific requirements for the Sprint grant application. As with all applications, the first place to start is the NOFO. Please ensure that the applying entity meets the eligibility requirements for this competition. Additionally, you will need to complete the pre-application steps that Amanda reviewed in order to gain access to and submit your application in grants.gov. Due to the iteration and proliferation of government forms, such as the SF424, it is vital to ensure that you have sufficient credentials within grants.gov to access the most up-to-date versions of the requirements for the Sprint Challenge. For those of you who are familiar with OIE's Build to Scale grant competition, you might be surprised to see that applications must demonstrate alignment with the most recent version of an EDA-approved Comprehensive Economic Development Strategy, or SEDS. We will go into more details during the live webinar on October 28th on the SEDS alignment requirement. Please be sure to note that the EDA has entity-specific requirements beyond the provision of common application elements such as the budget narrative and the project narrative. To help you identify what you need to include in your application, we've developed a Sprint application checklist on the OIE website to help you determine what you need to include. Please review that resource as you assemble the requirements to ensure that your submission meets our technical requirements. Next slide, please. Let's start with the project narrative requirement. If the Sprint Challenge application were a full course dinner, this section would be the entree. I say that because this section of the application is the primary place for you to expound on how your proposed project corresponds with the objectives of the Sprint Challenge. In general, when reviewing applications, the EDA looks to the project narrative to learn how your project is uniquely positioned and has the capacity to bring about the outcomes in line with the grant competition. As you assemble your response, you'll be asked to explicitly identify which region or regions your project will serve. In doing so, please include evidence to validate your claims about the opportunities and challenges facing your community and how the project will contribute to the outputs and outcomes that will help your region meet the innovation and entrepreneurship goals outlined in your proposal. Please don't forget to address recovery and resilience, not just in terms of the challenges your region faces due to the coronavirus, but also in terms of the opportunities for your project to leverage innovation and entrepreneurship through the proposed project. For additional requirements such as the page limits and font requirements, please review the NOFO. Next slide, please. Another important component of a successful Sprint Challenge application is the budget narrative. This consists of a narrative section which illustrates how eligible funds will be invested towards the goals of your proposal. It also includes a staffing plan and a budget chart based on the Form SF424A. Specifically, the budget narrative allows reviewers to determine how federal funds will be allocated across various budget categories throughout the duration of the project. For your clarification, I wanted to highlight the meaning of the terms federal share and non-federal share. In an EDA grant application, the federal share represents the grant amount that you're requesting, while the non-federal share, commonly referred to as a match, represents the share of the project budget that the applicant or your partners, if applicable, contribute. Amanda presented a great overview of what qualifies as an eligible source of match for the purposes of the Sprint Challenge. Please review the NOFO for specific guidance on how to document the match in your application and in any applicable commitment letters. Next slide, please. Now that you have assembled your application, let's discuss what happens next. If your application meets the technical requirements for a complete and eligible application, then it will be reviewed for merit using the evaluation criteria described on the next two slides, which you can also find in the NOFO in section E1. A best practice upon completing the first draft of your application is to review your submission like an EDA reviewer would. Look at each category of evaluation criteria and determine whether your proposal establishes whether it can promote outcomes in line with our areas of interest, including economic and innovation impacts. Does your proposal express the extent to which the project stimulates innovation, increases regional innovation capacity, bolsters support for entrepreneurs, and aims to rapidly address the health, economic, and safety risk caused by the pandemic? We're also looking for engagement and diversity. That is the extent to which the project will encourage the leadership and participation of a representative and inclusive group of stakeholders to deepen and sustain regional innovation and entrepreneurial ecosystem development. We're also looking for project support and connectivity. That is the extent to which the project is supported by and connected to partners who can leverage resources and identify effective strategies to address the entrepreneurship and innovation related opportunities resulting from the pandemic. Next slide, please. The next three evaluation criteria for Sprint Challenge applications are as follows. We're looking for assets and infrastructure. That is, whether the project has access to, will leverage, and or contribute to a regional economy's competitive strengths, assets, and infrastructure. As I've mentioned previously, resilience and recovery is a major aspect of how these applications will be evaluated. We're looking at the extent to which the project is likely to assist with economic resilience and long-term recovery from economic shocks due to the pandemic. And finally, project feasibility. That is the extent to which the application organization or organizations demonstrates the ability to execute the proposed project successfully, including if the proposed project's budget and narrative reasonably and realistically correspond to the costs and activities necessary for its successful execution. Next slide, please. Here's a high-level overview of the milestones associated with the Sprint Challenge. Although the completion of the pre-application task outlined by Amanda are necessary to start the application in grants.gov and can take weeks to do for applications unfamiliar with the requirements of navigating grants.gov. So if you have not started those steps, or if you're not sure whether you have the necessary credentials to move forward in grants.gov, please stop and figure that out right now. The EDA strongly encourages you to read the NOFO, which you can access now and on the OIE website. At the time of this recording, we're at the first stage. The application is open. There will be a live webinar later this month, and the application will close on grants.gov on December 3rd at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time. Once we complete the technical and merit review this winter, we anticipate award announcements in spring 2021. Next slide, please. If your organization is an eligible entity, can secure the required match, and has a grant proposal in line with the goals of the Sprint Challenge, then we encourage you to attend the live webinar at 2 p.m. on October 28th so that you can learn more about how to effectively respond to the application prompts in the NOFO and submit a compelling application. You can access a link to the webinar via the Sprint Challenge website. While you're there, feel free to look around the OIE website, which features information on other OIE grant-making programs, the work of our grantees, and provides valuable insights that you can use to self-evaluate the relevancy, strength, and alignment of your proposal with the goals of the Sprint Challenge. Next slide, please. And finally, I would be remiss if I did not recommend submitting your application well in advance of the deadline at 11:59 Eastern Time on Thursday, December 3rd. This deadline is strictly applied and exceptions are only granted in rare cases as outlined in the NOFO. Next slide, please. I'll turn it back over to Amanda and Emily now.
Thank you, Misha. That was great. We're going to jump into some frequently asked questions and just answer those up front for those viewing this webinar today. So we'll start with the first one. My entity is a current EDA award recipient or has received other CARES Act funding. Is my entity still eligible for funding under the Sprint Challenge? Emily?
Yeah, so the answer here is a very government answer is it depends. Generally, if you're a current recipient of EDA awards or other CARES Act funding, generally you are eligible to apply for funding under the Sprint Challenge. The important point to note here is that your project activities and outcomes must be entirely distinct and separate from other projects that you've been awarded under federal dollars. So awards made under the Sprint Challenge cannot fund project costs that are charged to other federal funding. We really want to avoid, we are legally obligated to avoid any kind of duplicative funding, and we are stewards of your taxpayer dollars, and so that is part of the reason for that. So just make sure that you check with us. If you aren't sure if it's different and distinct enough, please get in touch with us at oie@eda.gov, and we'll see if we can answer that question for you.
Thanks, Emily. But will I be more competitive if I focus on one of the specific program focus areas of the 4 strategic priorities that we outlined earlier today over another?
Yeah, good question. Thanks, Amanda. And I think you even addressed this a little bit when you talked about the 4 focus areas. The answer is no. We don't have any quotas to meet. We are not limiting awards by type of project or focus area. I think the point to hit home here is that we want you to be thoughtful about the needs of your community. You know how the pandemic has affected your community, the economic injury and distress that your community has suffered from the coronavirus. It's unique and different depending on the place. And so what we want to hear from you is, how are you responding to it? What kind of assets do you have in your community that will set you up best for an entrepreneurship and innovation project? For some communities, that might be a biotech or a supply chain solution. For others, maybe it's access to capital. So we just want you to think through and be strategic about, what is it that makes your community unique, and how can I best respond to the economic injuries?
A question about match requirements. We are working hard to identify the best type of match for a strong proposal. What recommendations do you have? And do you prefer cash or in kind?
Yeah, we'll just go ahead and get in front of this. I know you mentioned this, Amanda, when you talked about match, but we do not have a preference for cash or in kind. Again, your project is unique. You tell us what will be the most effective type of match that you can bring to your project. Like it states here, the best types of matching share are those that most effectively advance your proposed project. So you tell us what works best. We do not have a preference for cash or in kind.
And this is a question I know we've gotten. If my organization has a national footprint, will I still be competitive?
Yeah, this is another really good one. I think we are really looking for proposals focused on a specific community, region, or combination of regions. We are not prescriptive about what constitutes a region. Look, in some places, it could be a city. In other places, it could be a multi-county area. In other places, it could even be a tri-state area. We don't want to be prescriptive about kind of what makes your region unique. But I will say there are very special requirements that we've mentioned, such as the alignment with CEDS, Comprehensive Economic Development Strategies. And I think the point to hit home here is that it will be very difficult for an organization looking to do a national project to be competitive for this, mainly because they would need to have alignment with potentially hundreds of CEDS. So for every single region you will be working in, you'll need to have alignment with those CEDS. And we have more details in the NOFO about how to show that alignment in your project narrative and by attaching a copy of the CEDS. But the point here is that it will be very difficult for a national organization to meet that threshold for CEDS alignment. So we would really encourage you to look at a local or regional approach to your project.
Great. And finally, what can I use this funding for?
Yeah, so funds under the Sprint Challenge are really all about kind of supporting the programming and the operations. We can't use these funds for construction or direct investment in a startup company or any other hybrid investment model or individuals. EDA has a lot of other flexible funding opportunities that allow for infrastructure and construction projects, technical assistance, things like that. But these are really meant to support that programming and operations to make an impact on your community.
Thank you, Emily. And one more final question. Where can people find more resources and information about Sprint Challenge?
Yeah, you can find us on our website. So I would really highly encourage all of you to spend some time on the website, eda.gov/OIE/Sprint. The team has done a phenomenal job of putting together a very comprehensive toolkit for our applicants. We've got everything from budget templates that you can use if you're unfamiliar with the federal budget narrative format. We have an optional budget template on the website. We have an applicant checklist. If you're kind of unsure about which forms you're going to be required to submit, we've put together a super helpful applicant checklist there. Obviously, we have this webinar recording, and we will also be posting frequently asked questions that we will update on a regular basis depending on trends we're seeing. So please take a look at the website. Please take some time to really read the NOFO in depth. The NOFO truly is the North Star for the program. You'll find just about everything you need in that document. And if those resources don't help you and you still have questions, please feel free to email us at oie@eda.gov. And thank you so much for attending today, and thank you so much for your interest in the program.